welcome everyone to a special day, to Vesak, our Vesak celebration. And apologies, first of all, for all the delay, but we had some technical glitch at this end. So this is really the big day in the Buddhist calendar. And throughout the Buddhist world, there are enormous celebrations going on. Drums, dancing, feasting, all sorts of things. Here in the UK, of course, we're terribly British and very subdued. But it is a very special day for us, and it commemorates, of course, the birth of consciousness in the human being. The consciousness is always there, but for it to be incarnated and to get awareness to arise was really a special event in human history. And so we celebrate the birth, enlightenment, and death of the Buddha and his life, teaching life, all in one day, and that is Vesak today, coinciding with the full moon in May. Today we're very, very lucky we have with us Roy Sutherwood, who is going to be talking Buddha Day, Buddha Nature. It couldn't be a better title. Just one or two short announcements before we start. If you've got your diaries there, we've got quite an interesting calendar coming up. Next week on the 13th, we've got a book signing, sort of online. And that's a journey to the heart of the world, I think it's called. And it's the story of a journey into Pemmica, which is really on the borders of China, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, I should say, and India. And it's a sort of disputed territory. It's a territory in which the Buddhist life and the old way of doing things in that tradition, it still exists. But I don't want to take up too much time with that. But now I want to hand over to Roy, and thank you, Roy, very much for agreeing to come and talk to us on this really special day. This afternoon we have Venerable Sila Wimala at 3 o'clock, and he'll be conducting a service and chanting, and it will be a very beautiful event. So please come and join us then too. If you have questions, you'll see a little dialogue box at the bottom of your screen. And if a question comes to your mind during the talk, just type it in. You can either do it anonymously if you want to, or just with your name, and we'll bring it to Roy's attention at the end of the talk, and he can answer it. So big welcome, Roy. And Roy, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Desmond. I thought we'd start as we normally do, by arriving. So it's just a matter of being comfortable where you are, straightening the back a little, but not too much tension. Just letting go, bringing the attention first to the body, paying attention to the awareness that pervades the totality of our bodily sensations, and just resting there. Just bring the attention to the awareness that pervades the gates of the senses, what you can see, hear, smell, any residual tastes, and the totality of felt, somatic, bodily sensations. Just be present to those 5 sense fields. Immediate, simple, uncontrived perception. Just resting there. And see if you can widen the scope of your attention to include your awareness of mental consciousness. Big background feelings, if there are any there, positive, negative, or neutral. Pay attention to any propositional thoughts, strings of dialogue, processing of the past, present, or future. Images, memories, daydreams, whatever you find there. Not looking to change or interfere with anything. Not chasing after anything interesting, just simply Coming back, placing your attention again, being present to the awareness that pervades the five senses and mental consciousness. And just resting there for a moment. Okay, I've got a technical request for Marlon. Could you make it possible for me to screen share? I'd like to start with some prayers and the Heart Sutra, and I can put that up on the screen. So yes, it's Buddha Day. So we'll start with refuge and bodhicitta lines. I'll do them twice in Tibetan, then once in English. And then there's a short praise to Shakyamuni Buddha from the Shakyamuni Buddha. So it's a sutra, really. And it's a much longer puja that's very often recited on this day, on Buddha days and so on, to remind us of the founder. This is a much shortened version to give you the flavor of it. And then we'll do a recitation of the Heart Sutra. So bringing yourself back to presence, sort of calling to mind the Buddha as the founder, the Dharma as his teaching, and the Sangha, all those following the path of the Buddha. And look to, in the earliest kind of English translation, taking refuge or safe direction from the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the three jewels of the Dharma. Sangye chodeng soki chonam la jangchu badu dakni kyapsu shi dage jinso gi pe sonam gi drola panchir sangye drupa jo. Sangye chodeng soki chonam la Jangchu Badu Zakni Kyapsu Shi Tage Jinso Gipe Sonam Ki Drola Panchir Sange Drupa Jo. I take refuge or safe direction in the founder, the Buddha, and in the true source of safe direction and refuge, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. And in the Sangha, in the widest sense, all those who've gained liberation from cyclic existence and gone to full enlightenment. Bodhisattvas, all ordained monks, nuns, yogis, yoginis, everybody following the path. All those who would be spiritual friends and help us rather than hinder us on the path. And taking refuge in these three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, in order that we may gain liberation from cyclic existence and full enlightenment, not just for ourselves alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. Thank you. And then the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct. Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct. Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who were wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, forms supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, colour like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Saviour having great compassion, the founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. To those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts. To you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits, may sentient beings attain the rank of seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Then we'll do a recitation of the Heart Sutra, Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom. Thus at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling on Masavulcha's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice in the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates, also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, and not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance and no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom and no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as the truth since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata, gate, gate, paragate, parasangate, bodhi soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, and the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. Thank you. So let me set my screen. So I've got some. Okay, so today we're here talking about Buddha nature, Buddha Day, Buddha nature, and it kind of links or segues very nicely to Desmond's introduction, because he referred there to the Buddha kind of exemplifying the birth of consciousness. And Buddha nature is in many ways the seed or possibility, the potential for that consciousness to become fully realized, to become fully enlightened. It's that which can transform the way we experience our lives. The experience is there. It comes, we experience it, but we experience it in a particular way. And our way of experiencing it, if dominated by ignorance, attachment, and aversion, you know, that ignorance being the misperception of reality, the actively assenting to things existing in a way that they don't actually, rather than directly perceiving them as they are. And Buddha nature is the ability to realize that, to understand the first noble truth of suffering, to find its origin, cut it off at the root, realize the cessation of suffering and full enlightenment, and deploying the Noble Eightfold Path to do that. So Buddha nature is one of the most kind of important and inspirational foundation or understandings in Mahayana Buddhism. Possibly the most important. It's the kind of central foundation of the open, universal character of the Buddha Dharma, the idea that all sentient beings can realize their full potential and become fully enlightened beings. The Buddha appeared on the earth as a human being, and if we look at his life, the narrative tells us he left the hedonism and comfort of the palace through a route of asceticism before finding the middle path, not a compromise between the two, but something which was beyond the duality of both, and thereby realized full enlightenment, the potential of his own Buddha nature. So as human beings, indeed all sentient beings have this potential. I have a quote here from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Every sentient being, even insects, have Buddha nature. The seed of Buddha means consciousness, the cognitive power, the seed of enlightenment. That's from Buddha's viewpoint. All these destructive things can be removed from the mind. So therefore, there's no reason to believe that some sentient beings cannot become Buddha. So every sentient being has that seed. So I think it's one of the reasons for rejoicing on a day like this, not only in the Buddha's own achievement and realization of enlightenment, but to rejoice in the fact that we all have that possibility. In Eastern iconography, there is the symbol of the lotus, and that lotus is really, in many ways, it serves as a symbol for many other things, but it's a most striking symbol of Buddha nature. The lotus flower, as Buddha nature, emerges from the muck at the bottom of the pond, and when it appears above the water, it's completely untouched and unstained by the mud. And our Buddha nature is seen very much in this way. There's a luminosity and a purity to the mind, to consciousness, which is not stained or in any way defiled or altered by the defilements, if you like, the basic ignorance, attachment and aversion, which become expressed as greed, hatred and anger. These defilements come and go. They are not an intrinsic quality of our Buddha nature. In terms of the all-encompassing nature of it, the all-encompassing nature of it is often pointed to, if you like, by another traditional simile. We have the lotus looking at it as how it emerges from the mud, the possibility of enlightenment. But there's also a way of looking at Buddha nature as all-encompassing in terms of Buddha nature being present just in the same way that the sun is present in the sky, irrespective of whether we're able to see it or not. It may be hidden by clouds, but it's always there. And our Buddha nature, likewise, may be obscured by our attachments and defilements, but it's always there. So there's another important point about it here to think about, that although it's always there, it's not something we have, like a soul, for example. We know the Buddha taught Atman, Anatta, Anatman, Anatta, selflessness and emptiness. So this Buddha nature, whether you view it as a seed or as something pervading consciousness itself, is not something like a soul. So it's not something we have, but it's something that we are. Buddha nature, the idea that all beings will eventually become awakened Buddhas, is rooted in the idea that the mind is fundamentally pure and luminous. And although Buddha nature as such, if you read what scholars have to say about the development of Buddhism, is something that becomes maybe particularly important or emphasized in the Mahayana, it's right back there, rooted in the Pali Canon, rooted in the idea that the mind is fundamentally pure and luminous. And I've got another quote here, if I can refer to my notes. It's from the Pabhasara Sutta, which is the Anguttara Nikaya 149 to 52. And the Buddha said, luminous monks is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. The uninstructed run-of-the-mill person doesn't discern that as it is actually present, which is why I tell you that. For the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person, there is no development of the mind. Luminous monks is the mind, and it is freed from incoming defilements. The well-instructed disciple of the noble ones discerns that as it actually is present, which is why I tell you that. For the well-instructed disciple, the noble ones, there is the development of the mind. So that's the basis on which Buddha nature was developed from the teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon. It's known there as the Bhavanga. So here we should sort of bear in mind that all we can do in trying to understand this is to consider the analogies, look into our own experience, and bear in mind that as many articulations of it as we may find, these are really only fingers pointing at the moon. We're looking to indicate something when we talk about Buddha nature, about the ultimate nature of reality. We need to kind of try and understand the two truths, the conventional nature and the ultimate nature of the mind. The ultimate nature of the mind is empty, empty of self. The relative nature of mind is the kind of adventitious defilements that generate fantasized ideas of concrete existence, and on the basis of which we kind of live out our attachments and aversions based on that misplaced ignorance and engage in greed, anger, hatred, and so on. So the relationship between these two is actually expressed in the words of the Heart Sutra that we recited earlier. Form is empty, emptiness is form. They're not two separate things, they're inseparable. So the conventional and the ultimate are inseparable in the nature of our experience. Similarly, the luminous mind, as I said, called in Pali the Bhavanga, is free of any adventitious defilements. And when you look at the practices in the Mahayana, in particular in the traditions of Chan, Zen, Dzogchen, and Mahamudra, one just recognizes and rests in the nature of mind. But it's not another thing. It's not your kind of fantasized idea of it. It's not something which exists separately. Thus, it's not a substitute for the illusory I, which was denied by the Buddha in the Anatta doctrine, or anything resembling a soul. There's a good favorite quote of mine from the Dzogchen Ponlok Rinpoche, and he said, "Our fundamental nature of mind is a luminous expanse of awareness that is beyond all conceptual fabrication and is completely free from the movement of thoughts. It's the union of emptiness and clarity, of space and radiant awareness that's endowed with the supreme and immeasurable qualities. So from this basic nature of emptiness, everything is expressed. From this, everything arises and manifests." So, Buddha nature not a self, although it's sometimes described as a true self or an original self. In the Zen tradition, it's taught, look at your original face before you were born. So this will bring you close to Buddha nature, not by intellectual understanding, but rather by actually doing it. And in the Zen tradition, particularly in that of Soto Zen, Dogen, the founder, he made quite a paradigm shift when he was rendering a phrase in a Chinese version of a sutra. In English, it would look like all sentient beings have Buddha nature. Well, Dogen, not by error, consciously translated that from the Chinese into the Japanese as something which we'd read in the English like all existence is Buddha nature. So by removing the explicit verb, the whole phrase becomes an activity. You know, it's kind of not a noun for something, not something that we have, but what we are. And the implications of that kind of simple grammatical shift can really bring you to the logical conclusion of a non-dual approach here. His point is simply that Buddha nature is not something we have, is what we are. He takes I, me, and mine right out of the picture. It's not something I possess. When it's looked at like that, it's something we are. It's seen as an activity or process that involves all beings. And in this way, it can be understood as a practice which is not something which will give us enlightenment, but instead is the activity of our already enlightened nature, Buddha nature. So that's the way it develops. There's a sense in which there was a new view about the path and the goal, in the sense that with everybody having Buddha nature, as in your nature is Buddha nature, then it's possible for you to realize your Buddha nature and realize full enlightenment. Whereas before, the emphasis and centrality of Buddha nature as an idea, there had been an idea that maybe only Buddhas can become fully enlightened, and the best ordained people could do would be to become arahats. There are some interesting early sutras, such as the Lotus Sutra, where the arahats were somewhat shocked by the Buddha saying, we have further to go. You too can become Buddhas. You too can realize full enlightenment. In the Mahayana, one of the other developments here is that it becomes a possibility in one lifetime, theoretically, for every living human being. So it starts to become much more universal in scope. And one might go further and say that the possibility of full enlightenment is ever present, moment by moment, always available for conscious human beings to realize. So as far as Buddha nature itself is concerned, there are kind of discussions, many kind of scholarly and other discussions and debates about it, not only within traditional Buddhism, but amongst the scholars of Buddhism. And I was always kind of grateful to Alan Wallace, who was saying you can kind of subsume a lot of these discussions into two models. And one is a discovery model in the sense that we're already fully enlightened. It's just that we don't realize it. We're obscured. We're so blind, so ignorant, so overcome with greed, hatred, and ignorance and so on, that we're unable to recognize, realize, and manifest their fully enlightened Buddha nature. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of a developmental model, which kind of views Buddha nature like a seed that if we create the right conditions for it, water it, feed it, it could grow and become a mighty tree. The seed, or the potential Buddha nature, can develop towards full enlightenment. So they're both models that are trying to articulate or point to something about reality, about the nature of ourselves and the world that's ultimately ineffable and beyond words. So I think it's good for us to not, and be careful, mindful, not to mistake the map for the territory. Both models can be useful. You know, there may be times when looking at it from a developmental point of view can be very, very useful. There may be other times when looking at it from a discovery point of view that it's very, very useful. If you bring it right down into individual practice, for example, there may be times, particularly if you practice Mahamudra, Dzogchen, or Zen practices, where you're just sitting to recognize and rest in your own nature. Well, when you have those moments, don't interfere with it. If you don't know what you're doing, then go back step by step to developmental training. We can see this at a very practical level, as well as within a much larger philosophical view or level. I suppose another way of putting it is to say that Buddha nature is something that you are, together with all beings, and in this sense, already enlightened. However, because we cling to a false idea of a finite self that's set apart from everything else, we don't experience ourselves as Buddhas. But when you clarify the nature of your existence, then you experience the Buddha nature that was always there. It's good to think about it and good to analyze. Analytical meditation and contemplation has its place. But if it's difficult to understand, try not to do too much figuring it out. Just keep open in the possibility that it may clarify itself, just resting in the nature of mind. There's something there that also reminds me of something I remember Alan Watts articulating in particular, in saying very often, if we compared ourselves to fruit on a tree, we kind of make the mistake of thinking we are the apple than a part of what the tree does. Another fine analogy, a finger pointing at the moon, trying to guide us in the best way of practice here. Anyway, I think for now, that's kind of enough words from me. Happy to open the discussion on Buddha nature. Are you all still there? Okay, I've got the first one. I mean, if there are no further thoughts or questions or things to discuss, very happy to call it a day there and see you all again at 3 o'clock. Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. There was one thing I was going to leave you with a poem. It's a poem that translated into English from Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa, 13th to 14th century, great saint, scholar, and practitioner. And I always rather liked this particular translation because I think for me, it kind of brings us right into the present and reminds us of being present to the possibility of enlightenment in every moment, whilst kind of reflecting at the same time on the Buddha's insights into the nature of existence. The human body at peace with itself is more precious than the rarest gem. Cherish your body. It is yours this one time only. The human form is one with difficulty. It is easy to lose. All worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. Life, you must know, as the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. Therefore, set your goal. Make use of every day and night to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Hi, that was a wonderful talk. I'm sorry, but I couldn't get unmuted. That's why I was so silent. But it was a wonderful talk, Roy, and really great talk for Buddha Day. It was really quite a lovely talk. There's a number of questions here. Please say something more about resting in your own nature.
Resting in your own nature. These kind of translation terms really from the translations into English from the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions. It's the idea of resting in the nature of your own mind, in the nature of your own awareness. Yes, and if you can rest there in the purity and luminosity of that, it is free from defilement. So it's, first of all, if we go right the way back perhaps to the Satipatthana Sutta and look at the classic 4 foundations of mindfulness, when we practice, initially if you'll remember in those 4 foundations, you're looking at bodily sensations, then the feelings, so you're starting a little bit with how they're associated with the bodily sensations, and then looking at the feelings themselves, and then thoughts, and then the nature of the mind itself. So all the time there's a little separation between the contents of our experience and the way it's being experienced, or that out of which that experience kind of arises, abides for a while, and then changes, transforms, or disappears back into. The resting in your own nature is really coming to that point. It's that sort of wordless, fundamental kind of ground-like awareness. It's almost indistinguishable from our aliveness, our vivacity, and just resting there with nothing more to do. Now, it's easier talk than to walk the walk, as it were, but that is resting in your own nature, resting in Buddha nature. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you, Roy. That is helpful. I'm sure, at least I hope it is. I thought you described that quite well. There's another question here, which is quite an interesting one here. And that is, you mentioned emptiness a number of times, and emptiness has a variety of meaning in the different schools and traditions of Buddhism. And do you think that the Madhyamaka understanding of emptiness risks a kind of annihilationism?
It's a good question. There is always when we're looking sort of philosophically, thinking about Buddhist philosophy and seeing the middle way as a middle way between eternalism on the one hand and nihilism on the other. As the debates between the various schools about the nature of emptiness proceed, of course, it's the question of have you accepted too much or do you deny too much? You know, if you accept too much, then you err in the direction of eternalism. If you deny too much, then you err in the direction of nihilism. And of course, in those arguments between philosophers, talking about trying to get the finest possible articulation of the understanding of emptiness, shall we say, the austerity and avoidance of eternalism of the one is often criticized as being the nihilism of the other. So this is a kind of a philosophical saw that goes between philosophers developing views, but I think it's very, very interesting if you're into the philosophy, but I think good to go back to Nagarjuna, who is probably, you know, the giant often called the second Buddha and really regarded as the founder of Madhyamaka. Remember that he said, in the end, we give up all views, not to hang on to views, not to grasp onto views. I think it relates back to what I was talking about in the talk earlier, this business of mistaking the map for the territory. There's a point to the philosophical discourse and to the philosophical argument, all the while this is in support of or getting people to better understand the nature of reality and experience. But if those views are grasped onto for their own sake, that grasping onto views is as much a problem as grasping onto the notion of a self. In fact, the two are very much related. Usually that grasping onto views is because I've got it, I'm right, I know the way it is. So they're not unrelated, those two. So I think if we maybe simplify a little bit, and I'm hoping this is simplification rather than dumbing down, going back to those insights of the Buddha in terms of the three signs of being and saying, well, it's dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, that it's impermanent and that it's empty of any essence or inherent existence that is permanent, partless, unchanging, not dependent, existing from its own side. And that's what the Buddha was pointing at us letting go of. And the thing that we can really take on board in our own practice, however lofty or difficult the philosophy may become.
I think that you could go on all day, I suppose, couldn't you, Roy?
One could on that subject, yeah.
On that one. This is one which you could probably spend several days on. How do we recognize our Buddha nature?
How do we recognize our Buddha nature? I think I go back a little to the answer to the first question. That insofar as you can kind of normally our attention is always out there. Whatever we're doing, you know, whether it's just charging around like the monkey mind, it responds to stimuli, internal and external, but it's kind of, whether even if those stimuli are internal relative to the attention itself, it's sort of outwardly directed. If there's a possibility of inverting that on itself, sort of coming back within, resting in a wordless awareness of what actually is, then I think there's the possibility of beginning to recognize Buddha nature experientially. But it's that direction. It's that direction.
Thank you, Roy. And there's another question here, and I don't quite understand it, but I'll just read out what it says. It says, is the path for laypersons same for either developmental approach or the discovery approach?
It can be either. It can be either. Those kind of approaches are, as the idea of Buddha nature was developing, there was the idea that if Buddha nature is completely stainless, you know, beginningless, endless, not able to be changed or stained by the defilements, you know, if it's kind of like that, then there's a sense in which we must already be enlightened. just by being conscious human beings. You know, that the pristine nature of that awareness is already there. There's nothing you can't add to it, you can't take away from it. It is what it is, as it is. That's what we are. But we're kind of occluded from that. The ignorance, the attachment, the aversion, are like they're called the defilements or the kleshas in Sanskrit. Those are the things that kind of, we are lost in that. We think then there are permanent eyes, that there is this, there is that. We are sent to things existing in the way that they don't and behaving inappropriately because of it, building up habits, generating karma, and so on and so forth. So then the argument is, oh, well, if we're already enlightened, then there's nothing to do. You know, there's nothing we have to do. So isn't it more the case? And the root, the kind of the sutra basis for this is the Uttara Tantra. And then there are discussions around, well, isn't it more like it's a potentiality that human consciousness has? It's actually in all sentient beings, but according to the wheel of life and the 6 realms, can only be actualized from a precious human rebirth. But they're saying, oh, well, isn't it more the case that that's sort of like a seed? And if we create the right causes and conditions, if we practice in the right way, you know, developmentally go through the Noble Eightfold Path and so on and so forth, then at some future time, we realize enlightenment. And the arguments go on between the schools and practitioners who feel more attracted to one or the other. What I'm suggesting here, and it's certainly not original to me, is again, these are the map, not the territory. They're ways of looking at how we can practice. And even if you look at it from a point of view of, say, the discovery model, there's work to be done which would look very similar to the work of a more developmental practitioner in removing the obscurations. The developmental practitioner may have realizations at any point on the path that appear to kind of supersede the previous conceptual map of the stages of the path. I mean, in a way, another way of looking at this, which can be very helpful too, is to say, if you do mistake the map for the territory and take either of those 2 models too seriously, each of them will have traps. In particular, if you go back to thinking about Buddha nature and the logic that underlies it, but the traps of the one are covered by the view of the other. So it can be very useful to look at a very kind of practical and dialectical relationship between the 2.
Thank you, Roy. Now there's just 2 more questions that'll bring us to the end of this morning. One of them, this one is, in a previous talk, Roy used a metaphor about being at sea, birds on a ship. And that's really basically the question. I'm not quite sure exactly what.
Yeah, I can kind of see how that relates. When I was talking about it before, it was an analogy I was using in the context of meditation practice. But like a lot of the traditional allusions and analogies, they're used in lots of different contexts and take on slightly different meanings depending on the context. But I mean, that one does relate to Buddha nature. Going back to the context in which I spoke of it, it's the idea that if you're looking at, say, shamatha or calming meditation, there are 2 ways of looking at it in terms of practice. One's often described as the model of the swordsman and the archer, where the archer fires arrows in a duel with the swordsman, and the swordsman cuts the arrows with the sword. But of course, if the guard is let for one moment, then the arrow is through and the person is dead. So this is by analogy, when the thoughts come up, you hack them down, hack them down, hack them down, hack them down. But if, of course, you lose presence for a moment, if you're not there, then they're through. There's another approach, another way of doing it, which is to just open up, rest back, remain single pointed, and the thoughts will themselves, of course, eventually subside. And this is a good question, really, because it also relates to the question of how to recognize your Buddha nature. If we take it out of the context of a shamatha meditation instruction and look at it as a way to come back to your true nature, then the analogy is sailors in all cultures that have nautical cultures and did sailing any distance, would often not know, particularly in a time before maps existed, where people were making maps in actual fact. If they'd been at sea for a long time, traveling in a particular direction, and thought they may be coming near to land, but they didn't know because they couldn't see, there would be birds in a cage at the top of one of the masts, and they'd release the birds. Well, if the birds flew for a long time and then came back, they were still a long way from land, because the birds, unable to find food in a vast expanse of ocean, had to return to the spot, had to return to the cage at the top of the mast in order to be fed. Of course, when they were close to land, they never returned, and that was a cause for rejoicing on ships that were looking for land. But going back to our analogy, the resting in your own nature, or as a shamatha instruction, is if you can sit and let go, and I mean, sit is informal meditation, more likelihood of doing it there for us as beginners than elsewhere, but it could occur at any time. If there is the ability to let go, there is no choice but to come back and rest in your own nature, because there is nowhere else. So that was the analogy.
Lovely, Roy. Very nice. Beautiful. Now there's one last question, and that is the lovely poem or sutra that you recited to conclude your talk. Could you do it again? And could you tell us where it's from?
Yeah, it's from Tsongkhapa, and I think it's from his Songs of Experience. This particular translation is by Janice D. Willis, Jan Willis, a very excellent book called Enlightened Beings. But I've seen this translated before, but her translation of it I just think is perfectly done in English. Sometimes people get a scholarly translation right, but it kind of lacks poetry or beauty. Or sometimes in pursuit of poetry or beauty, important elements of what it really means is lost, or it goes off in another direction. But the balance here for me is perfect. So I'm really pleased to read it again. The human body, at peace with itself, is more precious than the rarest gem. Cherish your body. It is yours, this one time only. The human form is one with difficulty. It is easy to lose. All worldly things are brief, like lightning in the sky. Life you must know as the tiny splash of a raindrop, a thing of beauty that disappears even as it comes into being. Therefore, set your goal, make use of every day and night to achieve it.
Perfect. Perfect ending. Roy, thank you so much. I should also say that Roy does Thursday Tibetan class, which is online. So please join. He's also did a wonderful introducing Buddhism course in 1 week, and he will be repeating that. So keep your eyes open for that. And Roy, thank you so much.
Thank you,
hopefully join you all later on today with Venerable Sila Wimala for our little puja ceremony and talk and chanting. Lovely.
Look forward to seeing you at
Have a
3
lovely
o'clock.
day. Thank
Thank
you,
you very much,
Roy.
Desmond, and thank you for everybody for
Thank you.
joining us. Enjoy Buddha Day.
Thank you.